Hi, I'm Mike Blume. This is Lesson 4, the two trees and their natures. We're discussing the tree of life versus the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We began speaking in Daniel chapter 4 from Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where he saw himself represented by a tree upon which all flesh had been eating, that was cut down to the ground. And the dream came to pass when in his very mouth the words were being spoken, "Look at this great Babylon which I have built." And God took away his power, symbolically cutting him down to the ground like a tree. And we saw how that is very similar to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, upon which our fleshliness, our carnality, has eaten and derived itself from, being bent towards self-exaltation today. In fact, whenever we exalt ourselves and we receive thoughts and words from other people that cause us to lift us up in ourselves and not acknowledge God, hello, atheists. We are eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and don't even realize it. But it can even happen in Christians. Christians who really want to serve God sincerely, but all they know is to make themselves good by avoiding the evil and knowing what's right. You see, being led by God's Spirit is what is represented by eating the fruit of life. When God's Spirit's in you, it causes your nature to change. And you will do what is right if God's changing your nature. And that's what Paul meant when he said the law of God is written in tables of our hearts, fleshly tables of the heart, rather than the stone tablets of the law of Moses and the Ten Commandments. And when it's in your heart, your nature's been changed. But when it's on a table of stone or from a rule book of codes and laws, you're living by the law of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God's not changing your nature. That's why Christians, their natures continue to be bad and bent towards wrong. And they can't love the way they know they should be. But they try to mimic and imitate it. And that's just eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil more so. God's life has to be in us. A spiritual person is truly humble and selfless and does not have to put it on as an act. They don't want to be self-exalted. In fact, when they hear self being exalted by somebody else, they literally hate it. They detest it. Now, when we want to be humble and somebody lifts us up, do we honestly hate to hear that? I think deep inside we like to hear it. The fleshly part of us that eats on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil likes to hear that. It's in our blood. Paul said he had to keep his flesh or his body under, lest he become a castaway himself after having preached to others. The end of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And so that inclination to exalt self is in us because that fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is still in our blood. But we've got to start eating the fruit of life and learning. What I'm saying today, for example, is giving you fruit of life. Learn to live off of God's Spirit, His life, rather than from a list of do's and don'ts. Some people couldn't handle Christianity if there wasn't a list of do's and don'ts. They wouldn't know what to do with themselves. By the same token, if we learn to live by the fruit of life, though, we will know what to do. And that will be the only Christianity we can live. And let me say this, that is the only Christianity God accepts. One inspired by His life in us, changing our natures. Flesh is attracted to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that exalts self. Notice that the serpent told Eve, you'll be like gods if you eat it. You have a desire to be wise, this will fulfill that desire. And self likes that. And that's Satan's own nature itself. Satan exalts himself and puts himself in opposition to anything that is God. So whenever man thinks he's his own boss and needs no God and lives for himself, though man thinks he's doing his own thing, he's actually living by the pattern of the devil and building up the devil's kingdom. The devil started that. And the devil doesn't care if we think we're our own boss. He knows that he is over us if we're living by his principles. When we humble ourselves, God moves mightily in our lives. Trees are meant to reproduce themselves, rather specifically the fruit trees, through the seeds that are in the fruit. And the soil around in the earth would receive those seeds and propagate that same tree. The seeds from these two trees, the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, were both fruit trees. They were meant to reproduce themselves in the soil of human lives.